Let me close what's been a full and busy weekend with a few thoughts that I hope will sustain you through this week, lead you, of course, into some really good decision making. Sometimes the Bible is profoundly brilliant. I don't know how the writers got it right, but every now and again, in just one or two sentences, the writers of the Bible, under the inspiration of God, kind of just sum it all up, give you succinct information, right to the heart, stuff that really works. And part of the Bible that's incredibly practical for our living is found at the end of a book that was written, or a letter that was written to a church in the Near East at the time, in Ephesus. Paul the apostle, who of course had really been something of a violent terrorist in his younger days, is now writing and trying to pour out some practical advice. And he's trying to say, look, get things right. I'm just at that age where I feel constantly a kind of a fatherly sense about me. I get a lump in my throat. I look at the young people that I lead and I say, I want to try and protect you from doing some dumb things in your life. And here's some practical advice. And I can understand the heart of the apostle writing here. And in Ephesians chapter 5, right towards the end of that chapter, after giving lots of good, sound advice on how to do life, he says this, verse 15 of Ephesians 5. He says, be very careful then, that's worth noting, be very careful then how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise. That's just 2 lines, but it kind of sums it all up, doesn't it? Just be careful how you live. And then, if that weren't enough, he goes on in the next sentence, just as succinctly, to give exactly the way in which to do what he's just advised you to do. He says, making the most of every opportunity because the days are evil. I know some of you would probably want me to kind of dissect this verse and go back into some original language and look at the grammar and the syntax and see if there's anything particularly brilliant and profound that's all hidden in this verse. Actually, I need to tell you that everything in that verse is exactly what you need to know. There's no way you can cut it up any other way. There's no way that you can add to it or take away from it. It's just simple, in your face, practical advice. And if you really want a good translation, it goes like this: don't be stupid. It's that simple. Don't be stupid. Be wise. Make good choices. Line up good decisions. Evaluate your life carefully. Live carefully in a very, very trying age and society. Don't be stupid, the Apostle Paul says. And then he goes on and so brilliantly says, the way that you are not stupid, the way you live wisely, is to actually discern what time is all about. Understand that you're in this kind of time-space realm and make good choices about the opportunities of life because the days are evil. So I thought that that was very insightful. Lived long enough to prove that it's true. But then I started to ask myself, what really is all tied up in the sense of make the most of every opportunity? How could I explain that? Are there any ways that I can apply that more usefully to my own life? And it didn't take me long to come up with a little list of the ways in which we do make the most of every opportunity. And I share them with you in the hope that this week and in the months that lie ahead, it'll be really useful to you to live wise and careful lives. Here's the first opportunity that I think is wrapped up in the sense of this text. I think it means special times. Special times. Of course, I'm in higher education, and so I get essays from time to time. And sometimes I get some very nicely written essays, but they're extremely difficult to read. I don't know what sort of school some of these young people went to, but when I went to school, we were taught to punctuate sentences, we were taught to put paragraphs in place and to space appropriately. And there's nothing more intimidating, even at this stage in my life. There was a time when I was doing graduate level work and reading over 1.5 million words a year. There's still nothing quite as frustrating as getting a piece of work that isn't properly spaced and properly set out. I sound awfully pedantic, but it makes sense to space it and to enable you to take your breath at the right time and have a full stop and an exclamation mark and have the question mark in the right place. That's how we write grammatically. But let me tell you that it's also true that you ought to live your life the same way. You can't simply live your life in one passing blur, wondering where the days go by and how the months have gone so quickly. There has to be, friends, a punctuation of life. There has to be a spacing of the way in which you live. The way in which you order your life ought to be interspersed with special times, recognizing seasons and times and moments. If you go back into the Old Testament, you'll discover that God was really deliberate in trying to help his people understand that you just don't make it to the finish line as quickly as you can. You allow your life to progress through special times. Some of them were quite severe and earnest, and they celebrated the Passover and remembered the terrible things that happened and how they were able to come out from Egypt under the very difficult circumstances of the time. And then there was the Feast of Tabernacles, which was just like one big party. And they all came out, and the kids got money, and they had all kinds of exciting things happening. So God allowed for a variety of special times, and so should we. I think that we should celebrate birthdays. You say, oh, I'm just getting older and the aches and pains are getting bigger. Well, who cares, friends? At least you're alive. Let me tell you, there are a whole lot of people who haven't made it as far as you have. And you ought to thank God for another year, another time that you've been living and opportunities of life. And you don't resent the passing of days. You thank God for the passing of days and the accumulation of memories. That's good. That's wise living. Not living with some kind of regret about things, but I've lived again another day. I'm through another year. Thank God for his faithfulness. We sang all about it tonight. I don't want to pop your bubble, but Jesus wasn't born on December the 25th, but hey, that doesn't stop us having Christmas. You know, I'm not crazy about 4 months to Christmas and all the BER months. I think what's going on with people's lives. But when Christmas comes around, it's a great time to celebrate and be happy and share together and feast together and eat together and exchange gifts. You are wired, friends, in the creative purpose of God to be grateful for life and to enjoy living. You know, in Carol's book, she records the trauma we went through with our son's horrendous accident. We stood by his bedside in trauma-intensive care day after day, every day being told that he wouldn't live. We had to face his death, and many of you know the story, how God brought us through. And today, Jay's living a full and happy life in Los Angeles, which was great. And I well remember the day when we were finally told that we could take him home. It was amazing. It was as good as bringing a new baby home. You know, our boy was alive, and by that time his muscles had atrophied. His legs were only about as thick as my wrists, and the strap-in 22-year-old had faded away during those times in hospital. And so we brought him home, and we started to have little goals that we set, and you know, could he make it up the stairs? And what a victory that was! And then could we walk down the garden path? Could we eventually get across the cul-de-sac? And eventually, could we make it down to the neighbor's driveway? All of those were great victories, and we celebrated them. And then I'll never forget the day when we were able to go out for coffee for the first time, just me and Jay, and I felt confident enough, and he was up to it. He was still very frail. He walked painfully to the car. I lifted his legs into the car. We went off to coffee, found a nice place, and I sat him down, and I went to order the coffee. I don't know about you, but I drink coffee. I mean, that's not a religious statement or a value statement. It's just saying when I get coffee, I drink it. I don't inhale it. You know, I don't chew it. I drink it. That's what coffee's for. So I finished my coffee, put the cup down. Jay, it's time to go. I feel his cup. He's hardly started. He said, Dad, just chill, Dad. Chill, Dad. I think, what's it? He says, Dad, you got to understand, you don't drink coffee, you do coffee. I'm thinking this sort of some kind of reverse mentoring going on here, trying to work this out. He says, it's the ambiance, Dad. It's the people, it's the place, it's the conversation. It's not the coffee, it's being here, it's doing it. I said, oh, and looking at my boy, I was glad we were doing coffee, you know. So about 2 weeks later, we go out for coffee again, And he's a little bit stronger. He says, Dad, you sit down. I'll order the coffee. Well, that was a victory. I thought, this is great. He's got the strength to do that. So I sat down. I'm happy in my heart, so glad this is all happening in our lives. And the coffee comes over. To my amazement, my coffee lasts almost as long as his. I'm thinking, I'm getting cool here I'm doing coffee. And so I said, Jay, isn't it great? I did coffee. He said, well, actually, Dad, I asked them to order yours extra, extra, extra hot. But the lesson's there, right? That we don't live with regrets and we don't miss opportunities. And some of those opportunities are special times. I'll tell you another thing that I think this scripture includes is what I call sensitive moments. So I'm not your pastor, and I wouldn't presume to pastor you. You ought to be grateful for that. But let me give you some kind of instruction here. If you are a committed Christ follower, this is kind of theological, so just stick with me. If you are a committed Christ follower, something should begin to change in the chemistry of your soul. I gave my life to Jesus, and one of the first fruits was that we had to do a second language in school. It was called Afrikaans. And 3 weeks after giving my life to Jesus, I suddenly realized I had actually managed to go through an entire Afrikaans class without being kicked out and having to stand at the door. And I saw that as a dramatic change on the inside of my life, because I was just one of those mean 13-year-olds that loved to reduce teachers to tears. You know, some people like big game hunting, others play golf, and I reduce teachers to tears, you know. And so I found my way going through. So see, here it is, friends. There ought to be a developing social skill about your life, where you discern situations. You don't make a wide berth around people, and people don't make a wide berth around you. You don't continue being awkward or rude. See, that's why you're glad I'm not your pastor, but I'm in your face a little bit, and we're leaving tomorrow, so it's all okay. But discerning moments, being sensitive to other people, being sensitive to individuals' needs, not being insensitive and being coarse. The same Apostle Paul says, season your conversation with salt. Make sure that you say appropriate things at the appropriate time. And if that's been difficult, and if you find that somehow your personality has been forged and shaped in all kinds of other situations, here's the simple word: ask God to help you to become sensitive to opportunities and live your life carefully and alert to the circumstances around about you and become nice. It's possible to be a Christian and nice all at the same time. Sensitive, careful, caring, loving, gentle, appropriate words at the appropriate time, like apples of silver in baskets of gold. I started teaching a missions class as a young man, and I was only about half a chapter ahead of my students most of the time. It was very stressful. And I developed a technique that I use to this day, and I'm glad some of my students are former students and not current students. But I developed this technique that if I didn't really know something, I would say, what a great question. Do you know what? It's coming up in the next lecture. And and then I would disappear quickly and read very quickly and come back as though I was super intelligent and I was answering the questions. And well, that lasted about 2.5 months. And eventually I just felt I couldn't keep this up much longer. And I went in, there were only 7 students in the class. And I said to them, guys, I've done my very best throughout this term to deliver. And here's the reality. I'm about at the end of everything that I've got to teach you. And we had heard at that time, just east of where we were living, that people were fleeing the horrible civil war in Mozambique. They were making their way across into near where we were living in South Africa, and refugee camps were starting to spring up, and we'd got word about this, and the news had come to us. And of course, in missiological literature, it doesn't take you long to discover that there are certain people that are much more receptive to the gospel than other people. So transient people, refugees, and that's why we should be first responders and get out there, and we should provide sewing machines and water. It's all good gospel stuff. And so I said to them, what do you say that we just, instead of teaching mission, why don't we do it a little bit, and let's go out and see if we can find some of these poor, desperate people and bring them Christ's love. They were so up for it. They were glad to get out of the classroom. So the next day I had this beaten out old van that somebody had donated. I pulled up 7 a.m. in the morning and 7 students piled in. We made our way out on the tar road and then turned up onto the dirt road and couldn't find anything. It sort of was around here, couldn't see anybody. I thought maybe there'd be sort of refugee tents or something that you'd seen on TV, and we couldn't find a soul. And eventually we were literally meandering through the African bush. And I'll never forget the moment. It dramatically and significantly changed my life, changed the trajectory of our lives, and changed many other lives as well. But I saw down to my left-hand side was a woman sitting. She had some sticks pulled over her, tied crudely with a torn open plastic shopping bag, and she was sitting under that with her 3 children. I said, maybe she's a refugee. I mean, that's how naive we were back then. So we turned off. When I think about it now, how insensitive and stupid we were. But we went flying down, screeched to a halt, red African dust flying everywhere, and then all 8 of us pile out of this van at this poor woman all on her own. It must have been awfully intimidating. And I went up, and as sensitively as I could, I reached out to shake her hand. My hand was only 18 inches away from her face, and I realized she hadn't even seen me, even with that huge entrance that we'd made. She was deeply traumatized, deeply traumatized. It was awkward. I stood back. I remember there was a young man walking by. I hailed him down. I said, do you speak this lady's language? He said, I think so. He came over, and she responded to him. I'll never forget. I can never forget the next 5 minutes of my life, because in a monotone, with no emotion whatsoever. So just understand this. Complete monotone, no emotion, no quivering of the lip, nothing. This woman told us how she had lived in her village, the same one in which she had been born. It had been pillaged again and again by opposing sides in the Civil War. That's what happens. One group had come through from the north, pillaged and raped, and another group came through from the south. Her husband was conscripted and dragged off, and she hadn't seen him for months, didn't know if he was alive. And one day she'd had enough. She got her 4 children, and she headed in the direction of the setting sun. She knew that there was a safer place. In order to get there, she had to pass through a large wilderness area called the Kruger National Park, big African game reserve. On the first or second night, she gathered her children around her under a very large spreading tree, did her best to comfort them. They had almost no food or sustenance. And in the early hours of the morning, she realized that she was surrounded by a pack of hyenas. And she told the story, and I'll do my best to do it without making it any way more dramatic than it was, but one of these large hyenas literally lunged forward and dragged the baby from her breast. She heard her being carried off into the bush, and the next morning stood up and walked with the remaining 3 of her children. She told me that story. I heard that story. You'll understand it changed our lives. It changed our curriculum. It changed our priorities. It changed our commitment to ministry training and mission training. How dare I argue the petty points of theology when people need Jesus? And need Jesus so desperately. How dare I not be motivated? When we came to the UK, we mobilized, and Tom will remember, every one of our students, every year, into ministry somewhere around the world. We've done the same in North America. It doesn't work that way. I said it's going to work that way. Because people need to hear the good news of Jesus. In that sensitive moment, we went back. I looked in my rearview mirror through my own misty eyes, and every one of those 7 students were weeping almost uncontrollably. We put picks and shovels in the back of the van. The next day we went back. We dug the first pit latrine I'd ever built. Put a little tarpaulin around, at least give the woman some dignity. You know what? I have a sense that some of you might have moments of opportunity that you might not discern unless you ask God to give you a sensitive heart. Careful discernment, because that's how we live wisely. So let me move on really quickly. I think another moment or another time that we use these opportunities that the Bible refers to is what I call social opportunities. So again, allow me just to be theological for a few moments. You might not know this fully, but there's a whole dimension of Christian theology in which we speak about creative purpose, how the image of God is imprinted upon us, that we are God-like in so many ways. He made us for his pleasure to worship him and to commune with each other. And we know what it's like to worship. We've had some great worship tonight, and we come together in church and we raise our hands. But sometimes we forget that actually a very, very, very significant part of who God has wired us to be is to be placed in the family of God, to be a living stone in the household of faith, to be an active social participant in the church of God. So let me sort of flip that around and just look in your eyes and say, I need to tell you, I don't get it when people choose to live in some kind of outer orbit, far distant orbit, in terms of connection to the life of the church, getting close to fellowship and friendship with other people, learning what it is to actually share meals and get together with others and enjoy why we were made and what we were made for. And so I want to share with you tonight that a way in which to live wisely is to seek to find yourself actively committed to God's house. You say, well, I'm a little bit of an introvert. I don't really like doing coffee too much with other people. Well, get into those meetings. Get to opportunities. Share meals. There are so many opportunities in a church like this. You're spoiled for them. Thank God for them. I gave my life to Jesus as a 14-year-old. I didn't have much option, actually. I had a very zealous friend who invited me to church. It was a church like this. I sat in the balcony. The preacher preached and then did what I'd never heard before. He said, close your eyes and bow your heads, and if you want to give your life to Jesus, put your hand in the air, and I'll pray for you. I didn't really understand any of that. I'm 14 and a good Presbyterian boy. We'd never had that kind of stuff happen before. And as he said that, my zealous friend reached across, grabbed my wrist, and put my hand in the air. The preacher was onto it. I see that hand, he said, and then a little later, just one more thing. I thought, wow, this is getting, I thought it was just one thing. Now it's two things. And he said, if you raise your hands, I want you to get up and I want you to come around down to the front. I thought, whoa, I didn't let myself in for that. But my friend was determined that I would do it. So he picked me up by the arm and he sort of walked down the aisle as though I was, one of his great trophies, sort of looking around saying, I brought a friend to church and he's giving his life to Jesus. And I got to the front and the pastor said some nice things. Then just one more thing, he said. I'm thinking, wow, I'm going to be here all night. And he says, I'd like you to go off into this little room. It was a bit spooky, but go off into this little room. And there was a nice man with a big smile. And he read me some scriptures, prayed a little prayer, patted me on the back, said, God bless you, you're a Christian now. I said, thank you, that's very nice. And I made my way out of church. Everybody was much more happy about this whole thing than I felt, to be honest. And one young man who lived just about a block and a half from where I lived, he said to me, Paul, so great to see you at church. He said, we have a youth service on Friday night. He said, would you come? I thought, well, that's nice. That sounds okay. I didn't have anything else on. I said, I'll be there. That's great. Friday came, very self-conscious, 14-year-old, and by early evening, I just lost confidence. I just thought, what will I do? What will you say? How do I walk into the room? I turned around and I sat down. It was about 7:30. There was a knock on the door, and it was my friend. His name was Winstons. He said, I thought you were coming to the youth service. I said, yeah, I was. And he said, it's not too late. He said, actually, I've got my car out here. He said, if it's okay with you, we can go together. It's all I needed. So now I'm going to date myself by telling you about Winstons' car, because it was a Mini Cooper S with a British racing green stripe across the top. And it had sort of really wide tires that he had souped it up on. He had about a 6-inch exhaust pipe coming out the back. It roared like a jet engine. But the coolest thing of all is it had fur on the dashboard. So you're either laughing because you think that is so ridiculous, who would ever have done that, or you're giving your age away because you did it. But if I wasn't a Christian before I drove with Winstons, it only took about 5 seconds flat. He put that thing in gear, he screeched off, he didn't even slow down at the corner. That car went round on 2 wheels, and I found all kinds of religious things happening in my heart. I'm saying the Lord's Prayer, I'm crossing my heart. I even discovered that I knew something of the Apostles' Creed that I'd never knew and I'd learned. And I'm saying it all. We get out, and I've left my fingerprints on the seat, and we go in, and they were nice. I connected. I made friends. We prayed together. We went on camps. We did fun things together. And you know what? Everything that I love and enjoy in my life today as a Christ follower was sealed because of opportunities of friendship with other Christian people. Just practical advice. Make friends. The Bible says, he who would have friends should show himself friendly. Social opportunities. One last thought. What about divine encounters? Again, just a kind of a theological reflection, but you need to hear this carefully and well. Do you know that unique to our faith as Christians, absolutely unique, totally unique, miles away from any comparative, is the fact that there is not another faith tradition anywhere in the world of any ilk or kind that shares our deep conviction that we have a God who comes near. A God who makes himself known. A God who is immeasurable, who is beyond fathom, who is just amazing and astonishing, and yet he knows our name, and he makes himself felt in our hearts, and he convicts us by his Spirit, and he leads us by his truth, and he affirms his will in our lives, and he confirms his way, and he gives us an assurance of the fact that it's all okay. His love is absolutely real and true. It's remarkable. A God who's come near, a God who's made known. That's our God. That's why we have church every Sunday and any other time we do, because there's nothing more fulfilling and profound than to proclaim this truth. We have a God who is love, and he's made himself known through Jesus Christ. And the amazing thing is he changes lives, transforms lives. It's not just religious creed or do-goodism. It's internal transformation. And there are many in this room who could stand and say, I know exactly what you're talking about. We call it God encounters or divine moments. I was a young pastor, and a young man came in to see me. Special young man in our church. I held him in high regard, and then kind of wished that we had never made the appointment, because it wasn't long before he began to share with me issues in his life that I could never have imagined he had, or problems that he would encounter. And I remember feeling so sad and disappointed, and I thought, I've got to help this young man. And so I dug deep into whatever training I had had, and I shared some counseling and said, why don't you go away and do this, this, and this, and let's meet again next week and we'll talk about it. And he came back next week. I said, how you doing? Is it going okay? He said, nothing's changed, just as bad as ever. Still have this raging in my head. I said, okay, well, let's sort of dig a little deeper. And we did a bit more out of my very shallow knowledge of counseling and try to help him. And I prayed a devotional prayer over him. And I said, come back next week. He came back the third week, and nothing had changed. And I was so discouraged, so disappointed. I started to lack some confidence in myself. And I remember looking at him saying, maybe I'm not the right person to help you. Just not sure if I've got the insight or skills. And in fact, I'm not even sure that we're the right church. Maybe there's another church that could help you come into other areas of freedom. And it was really an acknowledgement of defeat. I felt so bad as a young man of God leading a church. I said, why don't you go away and pray about that? And if you need to find some other help, I'll support you in that. If you need me to help you find somebody, I'll support you in that. He said, thank you. And both of us, with the heaviest of hearts, looked into each other's eyes. He stood up and he began to walk towards the door with his shoulders slumped. And when you dream, you can dream about 1,000 thoughts in just a few minutes. That's in that level of your consciousness. I had that moment. It was the most profound moment. I suddenly found my head thinking through all the great benedictions of the Scripture, the blessings of the Bible, the proclamations of God favors that are listed from beginning of end. It's all there in the Bible. And I remember it was such a real experience. It was such a God moment. I put my hand on my desk. I said, Anthony, stop. He jumped about so high. He turned around. I got up from behind my desk. I looked deep into his eyes. I said, come here. Just draw a little closer. And these words began to flow from a source that I had not known before. I know now it was the help and inspiration of God. It was the God come near moment that I was encountering. And I began to declare scriptures that I did not know I had even learnt or even read. Remarkable how God brought them back. And I began to proclaim, the Lord bless you, the Lord keep you, the Lord make his face to shine upon you, the Lord be gracious to you and give you peace. Underneath are the everlasting arms. In your going out and in your coming in, may you be blessed. I went through half a dozen more. They flowed out of my life. I proclaimed them. I declared them. I released into his life the transforming power of a gracious and kind God. And then I found myself drawn to perhaps the greatest blessing that you'll ever find in all of recorded Scripture. Don't know if you know which it is. The story of the woman who was caught in adultery. Under ancient Jewish law, the punishment for that was stoning. Cruel, absolutely. Archaic and ancient, yes. But they did it. They dragged this woman out. I cannot even start to imagine the terror of obviously a young woman being dragged by these bigoted, angry men. And as they go, picking up as big a stone as they can find, take her to the place of execution, and she's cringing, waiting for the first awful blow that would lead to a painful death. But Jesus was there. So, of course, the religious leaders, as they always did, thought, here's a good moment to catch Jesus. Let's try and find him out. And so they turned to him, remember, angry, animated. They said, Rabbi, teacher, is it right that this woman should be stoned? And of course, he knew the law. He was informed. He was teaching them when he was only 12 years old. He said, of course, that's what the law says. And then the profound brilliance of our beautiful Jesus. He says, I tell you what, though, why doesn't the one without sin cast the first stone? I sometimes wish I could think like Jesus. What a brilliant moment. I'm sure some of them were poised, hand raised, and gave it a second thought. One by one, the stones were dropped. They disappeared. Till it was only Jesus and the woman. Do you remember what happened then? I think she was still cowering, wondering what would happen next, and maybe heard a gentle voice and dared for the first time to look up, and it was just Jesus. I'd like to think that he extended a hand. And I can almost hear the voice of the Son of God. Woman, where are your accusers? Looking around, there was none. And this is the profound blessing of our great God come near. Jesus said, neither do I condemn you. And then this benediction, go and sin no more. You know, we can pronounce the same in this room tonight. He doesn't condemn. He's come near. But I'd like to say in his name to all of you as you navigate life, make sure that you celebrate the special times. Become sensitive about who you are and your surroundings and other people's needs. Make sure you get connected socially. But then live under the amazing blessing of God. And make sure that you're able to hear his voice. You've been made whole. You have another chance. Life is before you. Go and sin no more. What an amazing blessing. So let me pronounce God's blessing over you as we come to the end of this evening. I pray your blessing on my friends, dear God. I ask that you would be the God that comes near, and that everyone in this room, wherever they are in the journey of life, would take a moment to carefully consider and then to live as wise and not unwise, making the most of every opportunity. I speak God's blessing over you, dear friends. May the God of all grace sustain you and keep you, surround you. May you discover that underneath there is everlasting arms, and inside is that peace that passes all understanding. I pray it in his beautiful name. Amen. Amen. Let me hand back.